Hello, everyone. My name is Shannon. I'm just going to give it a few more seconds to make sure other people have time to join us, and then I'll go ahead and get started. So I'll just give it a few more seconds. All right. Well, hello, and thank you for joining me today for this presentation. I am pleased to have this opportunity to speak with you all about financial aid opportunities for international students at U.S. institutions. Before I get too far along, I wanted to let you know that I will leave plenty of time at the end for question and answer. So if you do have questions along the way, just be sure to enter those into the Q&A chat box, and I will answer them at the end. As a brief introduction, my name is Shannon O'Hagan, and I am the Assistant Director of International Recruitment at the University of Missouri. My contact information should be displayed now on your screen, but I will also be providing this at the end of the presentation if you don't get a chance to write it down now. And I am joining you live from the University of Missouri-Columbia in that very building that you see pictured in my picture there. For a little bit of context, I work at the University of Missouri, which is commonly called Mizzou. Mizzou is a large, comprehensive research university located centrally in the United States, in the city of Columbia and the state of Missouri. We have about 30,000 students, including about 1,800 international students from more than 100 countries. We also have 300 degree programs from bachelor's through PhD. My university is a part of the Association of American Universities, or AAU, and we're one of just 34 public U.S. universities in the select group. This group is dedicated to research and high academic standards. Our university does offer scholarships for international students, and I will highlight some of those during this presentation. But most of the information I provide will be fairly general in nature. So here's an overview of the topics I intend to go over today. I will explain different types of financial aid and review the typical process you can expect at U.S. universities. It's important to note that this process will vary from one university to another, but I will share examples from the University of Missouri. This information is also specific to international students, or those requiring a student visa to study in the U.S. The process will look a little bit different for students who are U.S. passport holders or permanent residents. I will also provide a little bit of information about Mizzou's response to COVID-19. We've been asked by Cialfo to go ahead and provide a little bit of details about that, so I'll be sure to do that towards the end. And then, as I mentioned, I will also leave time for questions and answers that you might have for Q&A time. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I think a good starting point is to define what it is that I mean by financial aid. So for the purpose of this presentation, financial aid are the funds provided to students and families to assist with post-secondary educational expenses. So what we mean by that are the types of scholarships or other funds you receive to help you pay for what it will cost to go to a college or university in the US. And with this, there are really two main categories. The first is merit-based aid. And merit-based aid is based on, it's awarded based on your past performance as well as your potential. Need-based aid is a little bit different because it's awarded based on your financial situation and your ability to pay. Now, it might be helpful to know that even the term financial aid can mean different things at different U.S. universities. There are some colleges and universities who will refer to financial aid when they're talking specifically about need-based aid. At those institutions, they might use terms like scholarships or funding opportunities when they're talking about merit-based aid. So just realize that there could be different terminology used depending on the institutions that you're communicating with. But again, for the sake of this presentation, I'm using financial aid as a general term for all categories. In the US, there's different models of institutions, different types of institutions of higher education. The two kind of broad categories that we have are public universities, which are institutions that receive at least some source of funding from the state government where they live. And then there are private universities, which are essentially self-funded. And the types of financial aid offered by these institutions typically vary depending on these categories. So you will often find that public universities most often offer merit-based awards, and rarely will they offer need-based awards. By contrast, private universities more often have a combination of merit-based and need-based awards. However, exceptions do exist. So you will find a combination of different types. So be sure to contact the universities that are of interest to you to find out about the opportunities they have available. But this just provides you with a general rule for the different types that you'll find available. This is where I have some bad news and some good news for you all today. The bad news is that it is very rare to find financial aid available that will cover truly all of your expenses, or what's sometimes referred to as a full ride. As you'll see here, this is provided by the Open Doors report, which is through the Institute of International Education. And most recent report is the data shown. So this shows the primary source of funding. So where students how they're essentially paying for most of their costs or expenses at a college or university in the US. And as you see here, for undergraduate students, for students seeking bachelor's degrees, less than 10% of students list the college or university as their primary funding source. However, the good news is that despite this being, not the primary source, that does not mean there aren't opportunities available. So there are many different types of universities available, many different types of universities that have different types of funding available that can help to reduce some of your overall costs and expenses. And so I will go into those different types of categories that you can explore when you're looking at different universities. And I also want to note that I do have some really good questions already coming in, but just for the sake of the flow of the presentation, I am going to wait to address those until the end of the presentation time. But thank you for asking some good questions, and please feel free to keep sending those in. Now, when you are exploring different colleges and universities, you'll find some different terms that might be used that will be helpful to understand what they really mean. So one of those is the cost of attendance, or COA. So what this is essentially an overall estimate for what it will cost you for about 1 year of academic study at a particular college or university. So this should include everything from your tuition, your books, room and board, insurance, personal expenses, kind of that overall estimate of costs at that institution. You might find that universities will express this as their I-20 number, because this is the dollar amount, the figure that will need to be demonstrated as part of the visa application process in order to apply for a student visa. So when you hear I-20 number, or if you hear cost of attendance, this is kind of what institutions are referring to. So you can find out some more details about how they calculate that for their particular institution. Another term that you'll find is expected family contribution, or EFC. And this is the estimated amount that your family is expected to pay towards the cost of attendance. So it takes into account your family income and the assets that you have available. You might also find terms related to financial ability as related to the admissions process. So need blind admissions means that admissions decisions are made independently of your ability to pay. So the decisions are instead based on your academic background and performance, and your financial ability is not taken into consideration when giving you an offer of admission. Now, need-sensitive or need-aware admissions are different in that they do take your ability to pay into account when deciding whether or not you will be accepted into the institution. So these are some terms you can ask colleges and universities as far as their admission practice to find out whether they follow need-blind or need-sensitive or need-aware admissions. These are some of those common terms that you'll encounter. So I want to start by talking about merit-based institutional aid, because this is perhaps the most common type of funding that you will find available from U.S. universities. And there are different categories within merit-based aid. So as a reminder, merit-based is that it's based on your past performance as well as your potential. And institutional meaning that it comes from the institution itself. So it comes from the college or the university. The categories you see are listed here. So academic would likely be the most common type of merit-based aid that's offered. So this is often based on things like your SAT or ACT scores, or your grades, or any combination of the application materials that have been submitted. Talent awards are based on, as it implies, a special talent or skill. So an example of this would be for students who are musicians and perhaps applying to a school of music. Their audition to that school might be used as part of the process to also determine talent-based scholarships. There are also sometimes scholarships available that are specific to special populations. So international students are actually a good example of that. So some awards are specific to international students who fall within a special population. You might even find more specific awards that are created by donors of a university. So let's say you have someone who attends the university, who graduates and is an engineer, and they establish a scholarship fund specific to students in engineering. So those are the types of special populations that might have special scholarships available. And then finally, athletic awards. And athletic scholarships, honestly, it could be its own presentation, because this is a category that gets a little bit complicated sometimes. So with athletic scholarships, I'll just try to provide a very brief overview, and just understand this is probably going to require a little more research on your end if you're a student athlete and wanting to be a student athlete at a U.S. college or university. So in the U.S., there are different categories of athletics. There's different organizations that oversee what is called intercollegiate athletics in the U.S., and that is the NCAA or NCAA, as well as the NAIA. And within those organizations, there are kind of different levels. So for the University of Missouri, for example, we are a NCAA Division I school, which is the highest or most competitive level of athletics in the US. And with these different levels, there are different rules and requirements that are tied to that for the recruitment process, for the scholarship process, specific to athletics. So at my university, for example, and other Division I schools, the decision to be accepted onto a team, as well as the scholarships that are tied to that, are done through athletics and not through the admissions office. And so our role in that process is really just verifying your academic credentials as far as eligibility for admission. So with that in mind, my advice for you, again, if you are a student athlete, is that you do your research on these different types of categories to become more familiar with the types of awards that might be available. A good place to start are the websites for NCAA or NAIA to become more familiar and to also help to assess your own ability and what level you might fall into. So let's now talk about how you can be considered for merit-based aid. So again, there's many different types available, and with that, the application process, there's also different types, and this process will vary by institution. Within merit-based aid, there tends to be two kind of general categories. One would be automatic awards. So automatic awards are those that are given if you meet the specific minimum criteria. So typically, there's less often a separate application process. It's more if you meet the minimum, you automatically get the award without having to do any extra steps. And it also tends to be less limited in number. So these tend to be pretty prevalent in that they're not limited by the number of applicants a university receives. By contrast, competitive awards are limited in number, and so you are competing with other applicants in the applicant pool for the limited number of awards. And so with this, institutions might have different processes in place to determine who is awarded the competitive scholarships. And so with this, there might be a separate application process. There could be additional materials required. There might be a review, committee review. There's a number of things that could be involved with competitive awards. So this is where you'll just have to do your research and learn more about the types of awards available and any additional steps that might be part of that process. The timeline for merit-based awards also varies, but it tends to be fairly in line with the application process. However, there are many universities that have scholarship deadlines that are earlier than their final application deadline, especially for competitive-based awards. To give you a few examples here at Mizzou, these are our first-year scholarships, or the awards available to our freshman students. So you'll see the top award we have listed is called our Stamps Scholars Award, and this is our competitive scholarship that's available to both international and domestic or US students. This scholarship is very generous in that it does provide the full cost of attendance plus an educational stipend. But with it being so generous, it's also highly competitive. So it only goes to a handful of students in the overall applicant pool. And they're looking for students with very strong academics as well as well-rounded experiences. And so with that, there are multiple levels to the selection process, as well as additional materials required and an earlier deadline, which is December 1st. Now, in addition to our competitive award, we also have 2 automatic scholarships available to international applicants. The first is our Honors Scholarship. The second is our International Merit Award. So these are based on SAT or ACT scores, and any student who meets this minimum will receive either scholarship. These are also renewable for all 4 years. And with these scholarships, we actually don't have a deadline to be considered. As long as you submit the required materials prior to enrolling in courses, you would receive these awards. In addition to first-year scholarships, we also have transfer scholarships available. So transfer scholarships are for students who have started their studies at a college or university either in the US or internationally, and then decide to transfer to the University of Missouri. So these scholarships are based on grade point average, or the scores that you have earned during that university level study. And then they are based on a percentage of your tuition. And so that percentage is calculated and you see a dollar amount, which is the approximate amount that is given from that percentage for the different GPA levels that we're looking at. We even have a scholarship available related to our intensive English program for students who need to begin full-time with our intensive English program and then decide to continue on their studies for undergraduate level courses at the University of Missouri. We essentially will pay them back for any fees that they paid to the intensive English program in the form of a scholarship. So this is a pretty innovative award and something that's kind of neat to be aware of, and there's actually not a minimum GPA that is associated with this particular award. So now I'll talk about need-based institutional aid. So as a reminder, these are awards that are given based on finances or ability to pay. So how this is calculated for each institution is looking at some of those terms we talked about previously. So we look at the expected family contribution, or EFC, and subtract the cost of attendance, COA, to determine what your individual financial need is for that particular institution. Now, the university itself may or may not be able to offer you an award that addresses that entire financial need, but that is something that's taken into consideration when they are putting together their award package. And the financial aid package could include a few different elements. It could include grants or scholarships, and those are awards that do not need to be paid back. So they are yours to keep or to apply towards the educational expense. It could also include student employment or a campus job offer. And this is something that it varies by institution, certainly, but it's something where that's part of the calculation of the funds that you'll receive through that, counting towards your financial need. And in some situations, some universities will offer loans as part of that financial aid package. I will say this is quite rare, but it is possible. So just be aware that that's one element that could be part of the package offered. And the application process for need-based aid also varies by institution. And as a reminder, it varies by institutional type whether or not need-based aid is even offered. But for those who do offer need-based aid, they will often require some type of a form from you to determine what your estimated family contribution will be. So some of the most common forms are listed here, and basically what this is determining is your current financial situation. And so they might ask for additional documentation about your finances. The timeline for applying for need-based aid can also vary by institution, but it fairly commonly does follow in line with the application process. But of course, pay attention to deadlines because it does vary from one institution to another. The different awards I've talked about so far are really tied to the admissions process. And the reason for that is because that's the start of the process, and also because those tend to be the largest types of awards that you will receive. After admission, it is possible to receive additional funding, or ways to reduce your overall costs, but the larger awards tend to be given at the time of admission. Perhaps one of the most common is campus employment. So with the F1 student visa, which is the most common visa type, students are allowed to work up to 20 hours per week when classes are in session, up to 40 hours per week during breaks. And these types of campus jobs will certainly vary, but they could be anything from working in a campus office to working with dining services, residence hall, the library, any number of places on campus. It is important to note that this type of, these wages that you will earn should not be looked at as your primary funding source. They can help to reduce your overall costs. They can help go towards things like books or personal expenses, but you won't be earning enough money to cover all of your tuition and fees. There are also sometimes scholarships for continuing students. So after your first year, after admission, it is possible that you could earn additional awards. Sometimes these are offered by the university, sometimes it's by an academic department, and sometimes it's by a donor or someone who has donated money towards a scholarship fund for a particular purpose. And so with these awards, as I mentioned, they tend to be a little bit smaller than admissions-based awards, but it does vary. And the actual process to be considered will vary depending on the scholarship itself. A lot of universities will have an annual scholarship application that can be used to apply to multiple different types of these awards, but you will have to check with the university to see what types of funding and the process that they require. So beyond institutional funding, which is what we've talked about so far, which again, institutional funding are funding that comes from the university itself. Beyond that, there are opportunities to receive funds outside of the university. So we do have students who come to our university who have outside scholarships from any number of organizations or entities. So some of those are listed here, government awards, different industries, international organizations, philanthropies, community organizations. So depending on where you live, there might be these types of funding opportunities available. And if that is the case, then we can certainly support you in that process in terms of, in some situations, what's called sponsored students who receive their funding from all outside sources do have certain resources to kind of help in that process and that transfer of funds. There are also sometimes educational loans. This is less common coming from US banks and institutions of lending, but some countries do have loans available for students. And so this is something you would have to research to see what types of educational loans might be available in your country. I've listed here a number of different resources to explore, and certainly, you know, the internet can be very helpful for this type of thing as long as you're using a valid source to kind of look at some of those types of scholarship and funding opportunities available. For those of you fortunate to have good college counselors, certainly you can seek guidance from them and other reputable organizations to kind of help look for additional funding beyond what is offered from the university itself. And some of these resources even are databases that include information about scholarships offered by different universities themselves. Regardless of what type of award you receive, I really advise you to pay close attention to the terms and conditions of that award. So it's important to realize that some scholarships that you will receive offers for are considered one-time awards, which means that you will receive it once. It'll be kind of in a lump sum, and you cannot expect to receive it for future years. There are also renewable awards, which are what they imply. They're renewable each year, so you can expect to receive it each year you're a student for, typically it's a 4-year duration, as long as you meet any renewal criteria. And speaking of that, it's important to know what that renewal criteria or requirements might be. So for some scholarships that do renew each year, they might have you meet a certain GPA minimum. Others could have you submit a new application depending on the award type or other information to make sure that it is renewed from year to year. So just be aware of what those requirements are. If you do seek out educational loans, I strongly recommend that you pay close attention to those award terms as well as the interest rates to make sure that you are making a good decision with that investment. And then for those of you who are seeking external scholarships, it's important to be aware that external awards could have an impact on your scholarship eligibility. So for example, if you're given an external scholarship that ends up paying for all of your tuition and fees at the university, then you may not be eligible for institutional awards. And if that situation changes, that's something that you would need to notify the university. And so sometimes this is referred to stackable or combinable awards, so it's important to know whether or not an award can be combined with others, or if having a new award then makes you no longer eligible. So this is one of those situations, as with many, where I just recommend that you ask questions of the university to make sure you understand the awards that you're receiving. And then finally, it's important to be aware that changes in circumstances could change your eligibility for awards. So for example, if you suddenly inherit a lot of money, then you might not be eligible anymore for the need-based awards that you've received based on your calculation of financial need. By contrast, if your situation changes suddenly and you are no longer have the funds you used to, then that's a case where you can let the university know if you need to have your financial aid reevaluated. So real quickly before we move on to Q&A, I want to let you know these are just some tips that I have for you all. I encourage you to discuss all of this with your parents or your sponsors. You have a real, honest conversation with each other about what's realistic for your family. And that way you can know going into your search process how much to expect and kind of understand that with the scholarships available and with the financial aid available, whether or not you'll be able to make up that difference based on your family circumstances. And use that information to research your options. So there's a lot of tools and resources out there to help you calculate what the estimated cost of attendance will be, and certainly ask questions of the universities. Follow instructions, as I mentioned previously, and check for deadlines because they do vary by institution, and you don't want to miss out on the awards that are out there. And then finally, compare your offers. Make sure that you understand those terms and conditions so that you can compare one against one another to see that if a percentage award or a dollar amount award, how those will, what the end result will be in comparison to the cost of attendance. So just to wrap things up, I wanted to tell you really briefly about our COVID-19 response here at the University of Missouri, since we certainly understand that this is a challenging time around the world, and certainly one that is can be produce anxiety for students and parents just with the unknown of what's to come in the weeks and months ahead. So I want you to know that here at the University of Missouri, we are trying to be as flexible as we can for students applying to fall 2020 and understanding those circumstances that we're finding ourselves in collectively. So with that in mind, we have extended our fall 2020 deadline for applications as well as materials. We tend to be pretty flexible anyway, but we want students to know that we are working with you on this process. We are also now accepting the Duolingo English test as an alternative to TOEFL or IELTS for students who are unable to access testing centers for those exams. We also have a couple website resources if you're curious to see the response of the university for current students and how that's been impacted. So we have the first one listed there is tied to admissions. The second one is for the university overall. But just know that we are here. We are now working from home, our staff is, but we're still very much connected. We're still very much here to help and support you. So please do not hesitate to reach out with any questions you might have about that process. And with that, I will go ahead and transition over to talking about questions and answers. So I know I've already had some great questions come into the Q&A, so I'll start to answer those, but I invite all of you to go ahead and enter more questions you might have, and I'll begin addressing those as they come in. Okay, so my first question is, are students with U.S. passports who studied their high school overseas, do they pay the tuition fee for U.S. citizen? This is a good question. So it will vary by university, how U.S. passport holders are considered by an institution. At the University of Missouri, for example, and this is a fairly common way of doing it for public universities. So we have students who are either residents of the state that we live in, so the state of Missouri, or they're considered non-residents or out-of-state students. So U.S. passport holders, as far as the tuition goes, would pay the same rate as international students or a student from, say, California or Florida, which is our out-of-state or non-Missouri resident tuition rate. So this is a fairly common practice for state universities, but it certainly will vary. So the tuition rate itself, that tends to be how it is, how it differs. Or how it's kind of categorized, but certainly the scholarship process does work a little bit differently. So certainly contact the university if you have questions about those eligibility pieces. Someone asked if we'll have access to the slides afterwards, and yes, this presentation is one where it's being recorded currently, and so it will be available afterwards to view again. So certainly if you have questions about that, or need to look up my email address later, this is being recorded, so you will have access to it. Someone asked, how hard would it be to get 100% cost of attendance coverage with merit-based financial aid? And that's a great question. It really is a truly great question. It's one that I don't really have a definitive or definite answer for. I would say it's pretty rare. As you saw in the slide previously, there was about 8.8% of students report the U.S. university or college as being their primary funding source. So that doesn't even mean full cost of attendance. That means where they get the majority of their funds. So a full ride is rare. However, it's not impossible. So you will just have to kind of research your options to see you know, which universities have the highest amount of awards available to really help you in that process. As I mentioned, we do have one scholarship that does do essentially a full ride, but it is something that it goes to about 5 to 7 students in our overall applicant pool, both US and domestic. So it is quite competitive, but certainly try your best, do your research, look at the resources out there to see where it might be a good fit for you. Let's see. There's a question here about highly selective private universities offer few or none merit-based awards. Is that correct? You know, I can't really speak to the percentage offered by highly selective universities, simply because I don't work at those institutions, so I can't really speak to their internal admissions processes, and I'm not sure that I have access to exact information to really help you in that way. I would encourage you to reach out to the ones that are of particular interest to you and kind of ask them what those percentages might be. I would say, so kind of in general, if they offer few or none merit-based awards, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that as a general rule, selective institutions kind of look at a combination of factors. So some will look at your, certainly look at your merit. I think that's certainly part of the equation. But for ones that are, what we mentioned earlier, being the need aware, they might look at need in combination with merit to determine whether or not to offer you admission that comes along with a financial package. So sometimes if you're unable to pay for a school that is more need aware, the disadvantage being that they tend to only offer those generous packages that come with admission to students who kind of fit that criteria. So if you're not a high performing student, you don't have the strong merit to kind of make up for the inability to pay, then some of those highly selective institutions, well, that could be a disadvantage in some cases. But that's very generally speaking. And so I do once again encourage you to really contact those institutions to kind of learn about how that process works for them and see you know, how that might be relevant to your particular financial situation. Okay, the next question, it says, for universities who meet 100% needs, is there any way for me to find what is the average I will need to get 100% financial aid? Good question. Again, however, there's not really a simple answer for this one, unfortunately. Instead, basically, that's really going to vary by university in terms of what that cost is, what your need is, and how much that university is able to meet that. And so the first step would be looking at universities that offer financial-based aid. If you're not already just kind of a stellar rock star student who might be qualified for very strong merit aid that would cover a lot of your need. So it's something to again ask the university about. Someone asked if Duolingo is accepted for only students who are affected or for everyone. At this time, our institutional policy is that we typically accept TOEFL, IELTS, a number of other English proficiency exams. Duolingo is not one that we currently offer for all students. So as of right now, it's specifically for students who have been impacted by the situation, who are unable to access a TOEFL or IELTS testing center. So if you're not quite sure if you would qualify, send us an email, we'll look into it, and we can certainly let you know. Let's see, this one asks, do tests needed for university admissions, like the SAT or TOEFL, have to be within a certain time frame for admission? Good question. I'm sure you're used to me saying this by now, but it will vary a little bit by university. So for universities that have strict scholarship deadlines, they very often will require that you have all materials in before that deadline in order to be considered for that scholarship. So you'll want to pay attention to whatever that deadline might be. Now at the University of Missouri, where we do have automatic scholarships that are also offered on a rolling basis without a strict deadline, for that, we actually are pretty flexible on when we will accept those SAT scores, in particular ACT. So as long as the student gets those to us before they enroll for their semester, then we could still award them the scholarship. So sometimes we have students who are admitted to the university and then later submit us a higher SAT score, in which case we would then award them the scholarship. So good question, it does vary. Someone asked, how can we manage to achieve a full ride? So great question. Again, it really does vary. Full ride is very rare to receive. So to be kind of a candidate for that type of award, you would need to be an exceptional student who has really strong grades as well as test scores and those types of things to be likely to be eligible for the limited number of awards that are available. When you're admitted to university and you receive financial aid, is there any way to ask the university for more aid? Also a great question. This does again vary by university. So in some cases, some universities, especially those who offer need-based aid, sometimes they can reassess the financial package. Sometimes they can't. So, you know, it's one of those things where you can always ask. But it'll vary whether or not, depending on what the university is able to do. Let's see here. It looks like we are almost out of time here. I know we just have a couple minutes left. And so I wanted to let you all know, I will continue to answer just a couple more questions, but any questions that I don't get to within the next 2 or 3 minutes, they will be sending me these questions after the presentation, then I can follow up with you from there. To be sure to answer them. Let's see. It says, are financial aid decisions impacted by students' acceptance to particular colleges at a school? Is it more difficult for a student to get financial aid or accepted to, for example, the School of Journalism versus accepted to the university overall? That's also a good question. At the University of Missouri, it's not in terms of our general scholarships. There are also sometimes departmental scholarships, so it can be added in addition to the overall university awards. However, at some universities, particularly more selective universities who are looking for a certain profile of students, then it could potentially impact the financial aid offered, and that if they're looking for a freshman profile of students from different majors and they have someone applying to a program where that's not as often, not as popular, not as common, then they might, that might be an advantage in the overall decision process. All right, looks like I only have 1 more minute, so I think I have to wrap up the questions there. Most unfortunately, I truly appreciate you all joining and participating and asking these questions. And again, I will certainly follow up with those of you who I didn't get a chance to answer yet. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and all the best from here at Mizzou. I'll talk to you later. Bye.